Welcome to Dusk and Empires. Tonight, we'll drift through the floating gardens and golden temples of the Aztec Empire, where warriors became legends and the great city of Tenochtitlan rose from the waters of an ancient lake. If this sounds like your kind of bedtime story, subscribe before you drift off. Now get comfortable, close your eyes, and let history carry you to sleep. Close your eyes now, and let your breathing settle into its natural rhythm. Feel the weight of your body against whatever surface supports you. Notice how your shoulders can release just a little more with each exhale. Tonight, we journey together to a place where mountains rise from misty lakes, where the air is thin and clean at 7,000 feet above the sea. We're traveling to the Valley of Mexico, to a time when great pyramids caught the first light of dawn, and the sound of drums echoed across waters that reflected floating gardens. In your mind's eye, imagine stepping onto a wide causeway made of fitted stones. The year is perhaps 1450, and you're approaching one of the most magnificent cities the world has ever known. Tenochtitlan spreads before you like a dream made real, an island city built on a lake, with canals instead of streets, and temples that seem to touch the sky. The morning air carries the scent of flowers and burning copal incense. Somewhere in the distance, you hear the gentle splash of paddle against water as merchants guide their canoes between the floating gardens. This is the heart of an empire that stretched from coast to coast across what we now call Mexico, ruled by people who called themselves the Mexica, though history knows them as the Aztecs. Let yourself settle deeper now, as we begin this journey through time, through the rise and flowering of one of the America's greatest civilizations. The story of the Aztec Empire begins not with glory, but with wandering. For generations that stretched beyond memory, a people called the Mexica had traveled southward from somewhere in the mythical north, a place they remembered as Aztlan, the land of herons. Picture them as they might have been small bands of families carrying their possessions on their backs, following the guidance of their priests and the promises of their god Huitzilopochtli, the hummingbird of war. When they finally reached the Valley of Mexico sometime in the 13th century, they found themselves unwelcome strangers in a land already crowded with established peoples. The valley was a bowl of lakes surrounded by mountains, its shores dotted with city-states that had grown rich from trade and tribute. These settled peoples looked down upon the Mexica as barbarians, calling them Chichimeca, dog people. But the Mexica carried with them a prophecy. Their god had told them they would know their destined home when they saw an eagle perched upon a cactus, devouring a serpent. For years they wandered the marshy edges of the Great Lake, surviving as best they could, hiring themselves out as mercenaries to the established powers, slowly learning the sophisticated ways of valley civilization. Imagine the relief, then, when their priests finally announced that the sign had been seen. On a small, swampy island in Lake Texcoco, among the reeds and shallow waters, an eagle had indeed been spotted with a snake in its talons, perched upon a flowering cactus. The year was 1345, according to their calendar, and here, in this seemingly unpromising spot, they would build their city. The early years were harsh beyond imagining. Picture families huddled in reed huts built on stilts above the marshy ground, constantly threatened by floods, surviving on whatever fish they could catch and birds they could snare. The lake water was brackish and undrinkable, so they had to trade for fresh water from the mainland. Their neighbors continued to view them with suspicion and disdain, treating them as subjects rather than equals. Yet there was something remarkable about these people, something that would become clear only with time. They possessed an extraordinary capacity for adaptation and learning. Within a few decades of their arrival, they had mastered the complex agricultural techniques of the valley, learning to build chinampas, floating gardens that could produce crops year-round. They absorbed the sophisticated calendar systems, the complex religious practices, the intricate crafts and arts of their neighbors. But perhaps most importantly, they learned the political realities of their new world. The Valley of Mexico was dominated by three great powers: Texcoco to the east, known for its philosophers and poets, Tlacopan to the west, and mightiest of all, Azcapotzalco to the northwest, whose rulers had grown fat on tribute from dozens of subject cities. The Mexica found themselves caught in this web of power, forced to pay tribute to Azcapotzalco while slowly building their own strength. They sent their young men to serve in foreign armies, where they could learn the arts of war. They married their daughters to nobles of other cities, slowly weaving themselves into the political fabric of the valley. And all the while, their island city grew, as they systematically filled in the swamps and expanded their territory into the lake itself. By the early 15th century, the Mexica had chosen their first true ruler, a man named Huitzilopochtli, whose name meant hummingbird feather. Under his guidance, they began to transform from a struggling collection of refugees into something approaching a real power. But it was his successor, Chimalpopoca, whose tragic fate would set in motion the events that would make the Mexica masters of an empire. Picture the political intrigue of those days, as complex as any European court. Chimalpopoca had been raised partly in Azcapotzalco, as a hostage prince to guarantee his people's loyalty. When he became ruler of Tenochtitlan, he attempted to play a dangerous game, trying to assert his independence while maintaining the appearance of submission to his former captors. The end came suddenly and brutally. In 1426, Chimalpopoca was found dead in his palace, killed by agents of Maxtla, the new ruler of Azcapotzalco, who had decided the Mexica were growing too bold. With their leader murdered, the people of Tenochtitlan faced a choice: submit completely to their overlords, or risk everything in a war they seemed certain to lose. It was then that a prince named Itzcoatl stepped forward to claim the throne. His name meant obsidian serpent, and he possessed a warrior's heart beneath the careful mind of a politician. More importantly, he had the support of his nephew, a young man named Tlacaelel, whose genius for organization and strategy would reshape the very nature of Mexica society. Itzcoatl understood that the Mexica could not face Azcapotzalco alone. In secret negotiations that required all his diplomatic skill, he forged an alliance with two other powers who had grown weary of Azcapotzalco's dominance: Nezahualcóyotl, the exiled poet king of Texcoco, and the rulers of Tlacopan. This triple alliance would become the foundation of Aztec power for the next century. The war that followed lasted 3 years and transformed the political landscape of central Mexico forever. Imagine the tension as the Allies slowly tightened their grip around Azcapotzalco, cutting off its trade routes, winning over its subject cities one by one. The Mexica proved themselves fearsome warriors, their obsidian-edged clubs and atlotl spear-throwers devastating in close combat. But it was not just military prowess that won the war. Itzcoatl and his advisors proved masterful at psychological warfare, spreading propaganda about Azcapotzalco's weakness, encouraging rebellion among its subjects. They presented themselves not as conquerors, but as liberators, come to free the valley from tyrannical rule. When Azcapotzalco finally fell in 1428, its ruler Maxtla was captured in sacrifice to the gods in a ceremony that announced the arrival of a new power. The victorious allies divided the spoils, but it was the Mexica who claimed the largest share. They had proven themselves not just as warriors, but as leaders capable of organizing and sustaining a complex political coalition. In the aftermath of victory, something remarkable happened. Itzcoatl ordered that the old books be burned, not from ignorance, but from a sophisticated understanding of the power of historical narrative. The scribes and priests were commanded to create new histories that portrayed the Mexica not as recent arrivals and former subjects, but as the rightful heirs to the great Toltec civilization that had ruled central Mexico centuries earlier. This rewriting of history served a crucial purpose. It legitimized Mexica rule not just through conquest, but through divine mandate and ancient precedent. The people of Tenochtitlan began to see themselves not as lucky survivors, but as a chosen people destined to rule over their neighbors. It was a transformation of identity that would echo through the generations, shaping how they understood their place in the world and their obligations to their gods. Under Itzcoatl's successors, particularly the ruler known as Moctezuma Ilhuacamana, Moctezuma the Elder, he who shoots arrows at the sky, Tenochtitlan began its transformation into one of the world's most magnificent cities. Picture the island as it appeared in the mid-15th century, no longer a collection of reed huts, but a carefully planned urban masterpiece that would have impressed visitors from Rome or Constantinople. The heart of the city was the Great Temple, a massive stepped pyramid that rose over 100 feet above the lake. Its twin shrines honored both Huitzilopochtli, the war god who had guided the Mexica to their destiny, and Tlaloc, the ancient rain god whose favor was essential for the crops that fed the growing population. From its summit, priests could look out over the entire valley, watching the sun rise over the mountains to the east and set behind the western peaks. Surrounding the temple complex, the city spread outward in carefully ordered districts. Wide canals served as the main thoroughfares, with smaller waterways branching off like capillaries to reach every neighborhood. Imagine the sound of morning in such a place, the splash of paddle against water as thousands of canoes began their daily journeys, the calls of vendors hawking their wares from boat to boat, the distant sound of conch shell trumpets announcing the dawn rituals at the temples. The houses of the nobility were marvels of engineering and artistry. Built of stone and adobe, they rose 2 and sometimes 3 stories above the canals, their walls painted in brilliant colors and decorated with intricate carvings. Gardens bloomed on rooftops and terraces, filled with flowers that the Mexica loved above all material treasures. The scent of jasmine and marigolds, sacred sampasicil and rare orchids, perfumed the air along with the ever-present smoke of copal incense. But perhaps most remarkable were the chinampas, the floating gardens that surrounded the city. Picture these rectangular plots of incredibly fertile land, separated by narrow canals, stretching as far as the eye could see across the lake's shallow waters. They were not truly floating, but rather carefully constructed plots of soil and vegetation anchored to the lake bottom with posts and weaving. Here, Mexica farmers could grow crops year-round, producing yields so abundant that Tenochtitlan could support a population larger than most European cities of the time. The engineering required for such a city was staggering. Fresh water was brought from springs on the mainland through a sophisticated aqueduct system. Dikes and canals controlled flooding and provided transportation networks. Causeways connected the island to the shore, each wide enough for 8 men to walk abreast, with drawbridges that could be raised to protect the city from attack. But Tenochtitlan was more than just an impressive collection of buildings and waterways. It was a living symbol of Mexica achievement, designed to inspire awe in visitors and pride in its inhabitants. The Great Temple itself was rebuilt and enlarged several times during this period, each new layer more magnificent than the last. When rulers from distant cities came to pay tribute or negotiate treaties, they would find themselves walking through halls lined with precious stones, past walls covered in gold and feathers, beneath ceilings painted with scenes of divine glory. The markets of Tenochtitlan became legendary throughout Mesoamerica. In the great plaza of Tlatelolco, merchants from the far reaches of the empire and beyond gathered to trade goods that spanned the known world. Here you might find vendors selling quetzal feathers from the distant rainforests, obsidian blades sharper than any metal tool, chocolate ground from cacao beans and flavored with vanilla and chile, textiles dyed in colors so vivid they seemed to glow in the sunlight. The social order that governed this magnificent city was as carefully structured as its physical layout. At the apex stood the Huitzilopochtli, the great speaker, whose word was law and whose person was considered sacred. Below him ranked the nobility, the Pipiltin, distinguished by their elaborate clothing, their right to own land, and their exclusive access to certain luxury goods. The commoners, the Masaholtin, formed the backbone of society: farmers and craftsmen, warriors and merchants, each bound to their kalpuli, their neighborhood community that provided both identity and social services. At the bottom of the social hierarchy were the slaves, but even slavery among the Mexica was a more complex institution than in many other societies. A person might become enslaved through debt, crime, or capture in war, but their children were born free. Many slaves lived lives little different from those of poor commoners, and some even achieved positions of responsibility and respect within noble households. To understand the Aztec Empire, one must understand the central role that warfare played in Mexica society. This was not merely a matter of conquest and tribute, though those were important. War was woven into the very fabric of their religion, their social structure, and their understanding of cosmic order. For the Mexica believed that the sun itself was a warrior god who fought each day against the forces of darkness, and that human warriors were his companions in this eternal struggle. Picture a young Mexica boy, perhaps 10 years old, beginning his education in the art of war. If he was born to a commoner family, he would attend the Telpacali, the house of youth, where boys from his neighborhood learned together. If his family was noble, he might be sent to the Calmacac, the elite school attached to a temple, where the training was even more rigorous. Either way, his days would be filled with physical conditioning, weapons practice, and the study of military tactics and history. The weapons he learned to use were marvels of their kind, despite being made without metal. The macuawil, the obsidian-edged club that was every warrior's primary weapon, could slice through flesh and bone with devastating efficiency. The atlotl, a spear thrower that extended the range and power of the human arm, could drive a dart through Spanish armor when the Europeans finally arrived. Shields were made of wood and leather, often decorated with brilliant feather work that identified the warrior's rank and achievements. But perhaps most important was the psychological training. Boys were taught that death in battle was not to be feared, but welcomed as the highest honor a man could achieve. Warriors who died fighting would join the sun in its daily journey across the sky, spending their afterlife in paradise before returning to Earth as hummingbirds or butterflies. This belief created a warrior culture of extraordinary ferocity and dedication. When a young man proved himself in battle by taking his first captive, he underwent a transformation that touched every aspect of his life. He was now officially a warrior, entitled to wear certain clothing and ornaments, to participate in specific ceremonies, and to drink pulque, the mildly alcoholic beverage made from the maguey plant. As he took more captives and performed greater feats, his status continued to rise, until the most successful might join the elite warrior orders of the Eagle Knights and Jaguar Knights. These orders were more than military units, they were religious brotherhoods whose members dedicated their lives to the service of specific gods. Picture an eagle knight in his full regalia, his body painted in brilliant colors, wearing a helmet shaped like an eagle's head with real feathers, a costume that transformed him into a living embodiment of divine power. The Jaguar Knights dressed themselves in actual jaguar pelts, complete with heads and claws, becoming earthly representatives of the night sun as it journeyed through the underworld. Not all warfare, however, was aimed at conquest. The Mexica developed a unique institution known as the Flower Wars, ritual conflicts fought primarily to capture enemies for sacrifice rather than to gain territory. These battles were arranged by mutual agreement between cities, with specific rules governing when and where they would take place. Imagine such a battle, warriors from both sides meeting on a predetermined battlefield, fighting with the goal not of killing their enemies, but of taking them alive to provide the gods with the precious gift of human hearts. The Flower Wars served multiple purposes in Mexica society. They provided a constant supply of sacrificial victims needed to maintain cosmic balance. They allowed young warriors to prove themselves without the risks of full-scale war. And they created a ritualized outlet for the aggression and competition that might otherwise have led to destructive conflicts between allied cities. But the empire's expansion required more than ritual combat. The Mexica and their allies launched systematic campaigns of conquest that gradually brought most of central Mexico under their control. These wars followed a pattern that became familiar throughout the empire's domain. First, ambassadors would be sent demanding submission and tribute. If these demands were refused, economic pressure would be applied, cutting off trade and encouraging rebellion among the target city's own subjects. Only if these methods failed would direct military force be employed. The goal was never to destroy or replace the existing political structure of conquered territories. Instead, the Mexica preferred to leave local rulers in place, transforming them from independent lords into tribute-paying vassals. This system required fewer resources to maintain and created less resentment among subject peoples, while still providing the empire with the wealth and manpower it needed to continue expanding. Victory in war brought not only territory and tribute, but also prestige and divine favor. The Mexica believed that their gods, particularly Huitzilopochtli, actively supported their conquests because the expansion of the empire served cosmic purposes. Each victory was proof of divine approval, each defeat a sign that the gods required greater devotion and sacrifice. This created a psychological dynamic that drove continuous expansion. Success demanded more success, conquest necessitated further conquest. The beating heart of Mexica civilization was not its military might or its impressive architecture, but its profound and complex understanding of the sacred cosmos. To grasp the meaning of the Aztec Empire, one must enter a world where every sunrise was a victory won through divine struggle, where human beings bore responsibility for maintaining the very fabric of reality, and where the line between the physical and spiritual worlds was thin as morning mist. Picture the Mexica understanding of creation itself. They believed that the current world was the fifth in a series of creations, each of which had been destroyed when the gods grew dissatisfied with their work. The previous four worlds had ended in catastrophe, by jaguar, by wind, by fire, by flood, and this fifth world, the world of movement and earthquakes, would someday meet the same fate. But for now, it was the duty of humanity to postpone that ending through proper ritual and sacrifice. At the center of this cosmic drama stood the sun itself, imagined as the god Tonatiuh, who had sacrificed himself to set the heavens in motion. But his divine sacrifice was not a one-time event. Each dawn required new offerings to give him strength for his daily battle against the forces of darkness. Each sunset marked his descent into the underworld, where he would fight through the night to rise again. Human hearts, still warm with blood, were the food that sustained him in this eternal struggle. The practice of human sacrifice that so horrified the Spanish conquistadors was thus not cruelty, but cosmic necessity in Mexica understanding. Picture the great ceremonies atop the pyramid of Huitzilopochtli, where priests dressed as gods would guide captured warriors up the steep stone steps. At the summit, before the shrine where sacred fires burned continuously, the victim would be held across a curved sacrificial stone while the priest cut through skin and muscle with an obsidian knife to remove the still beating heart. The heart would be offered to the four directions and then to the sky, feeding the sun with its precious blood. The body would tumble down the pyramid steps, coming to rest at the bottom where it might be claimed by the captor's family for a ritual feast. To the Mexica, this was not murder but the highest form of spiritual nourishment, a way of returning to the gods the life force they had originally provided. But sacrifice took many forms, each suited to different gods and occasions. Children were sometimes sacrificed to Tlaloc, the rain god, their tears interpreted as signs that the rains would come. Young women might be flayed alive to honor Xipe-Totec, the flayed lord, whose priest would then wear their skin as a symbol of the earth's renewal each spring. Merchants returning from long trading expeditions might offer slaves to Yaxcoatl, the god of commerce, ensuring continued prosperity in their ventures. Perhaps most elaborate were the ceremonies dedicated to Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror, god of the night sky and of conflict. Once each year, a perfect young man would be chosen to represent this god, living for an entire year as Tezcatlipoca's earthly embodiment. He would be dressed in the finest clothes, taught to play the flute, given 4 beautiful wives, and treated with the reverence due to a deity. Then, at the ceremony's climax, he would climb alone up the steps of the temple, breaking his flutes as he ascended, and offer himself willingly to the sacrificial knife. To understand how the Mexica could embrace such practices, one must grasp their conception of death itself. They believed that the manner of one's death determined the destination of one's soul in the afterlife. Warriors who died in battle or on the sacrificial stone joined the sun in the eastern sky. Women who died in childbirth, honored as warriors who had died capturing an enemy, accompanied the sun on its western journey. Most others traveled to Mictlan, the land of the dead, not as punishment but as a natural destination where they would find peace. The calendar that governed these ceremonies was itself a marvel of intellectual achievement. The Mexica combined 2 different systems of timekeeping, a 260-day sacred calendar that governed religious observances, and a 365-day solar calendar that tracked the agricultural year. Every 52 years, these calendars would align again in a ceremony called the New Fire, when all fires throughout the empire would be extinguished and then relit from a sacred flame to mark the renewal of cosmic time. Picture that ceremony as it might have appeared to someone living through it. For 5 days before the new fire, all normal activity would cease. People would fast, break their pottery, and throw their belongings into the lakes. Pregnant women would be locked indoors lest they turn into demons. When the moment came, priests would climb to the summit of the Hill of the Star, where they would light a new fire in the open chest of a sacrificial victim. From this sacred flame, runners would carry torches to relight the fires in every temple, and from there to every home in the empire. The relief and joy that greeted the successful completion of this ceremony was profound. People would emerge from their houses to see the sun rise again, assured that the world would continue for another 52 years. They would feast and exchange gifts, renewing their commitment to the cosmic order that their ancestors had maintained for generations. In that moment, they were not just celebrating the continuation of life, but their own role as active participants in the divine plan that kept the universe in motion. The empire reached its greatest extent and most magnificent flowering under the rule of Moctezuma Xocoyotzin, Moctezuma the Younger, who ascended to the throne in 1502. Picture him as he might have appeared on his coronation day, a man in his 30s, tall for his people, with the bearing of someone born to command. He wore a cloak of finest cotton decorated with feathers from the sacred Quetzal bird, and on his head sat a crown of gold and precious stones that caught the light like captured stars. Around him gathered the greatest nobles of the empire, each dressed in costumes that would have seemed fantastical to foreign eyes, cloaks of feathers that shimmered with every movement, jewelry of jade and obsidian, headdresses that towered above their heads like architectural marvels. Moctezuma inherited an empire that stretched from coast to coast across central Mexico, from the tropical lowlands where cacao and cotton grew to the high pine forests where amber was harvested. Trade routes connected distant provinces, carrying goods and ideas across hundreds of miles. Tribute flowed into Tenochtitlan from dozens of subject cities, tons of corn and beans, bales of fine textiles, shields and weapons, precious stones and metals, exotic feathers and rare woods. The wealth of an entire civilization converged on the lake-bound capital, making possible levels of luxury and artistic achievement that would not be seen again in the Americas for centuries. Under Moctezuma's rule, the art of featherworking reached heights that amazed even European observers. Master craftsmen called Amantika worked with feathers as others worked with gold, creating images so lifelike they seemed ready to move. Picture the workshop of such an artist, a quiet room filled with the most precious materials imaginable, sorted by color and size. The blue-green plumes of the quetzal, worth more than their weight in gold. The brilliant red feathers of the spoonbill. The iridescent black of the crow, the pure white of the egret, hundreds of subtle shades gathered from birds across the empire and beyond. These craftsmen would work for months on a single piece, gluing individual feathers to cotton cloth with such precision that the finished work appeared to be carved from precious stone rather than assembled from organic materials. They created cloaks for the emperor, shields for elite warriors, decorations for temples, gifts for foreign dignitaries, all with techniques that died with the conquest and have never been fully recovered. The palace where Moctezuma held court was itself a wonder of the world. Spanish observers later wrote that it contained more rooms than the greatest European castles, each one decorated with a luxury that surpassed their imagination. The walls were hung with tapestries of featherwork and cotton. The floors were covered with mats so fine they felt like silk beneath bare feet. Gardens within the palace complex contained not only flowers and medicinal plants, but aviaries filled with birds from every corner of the empire, and even a zoo where jaguars and eagles were kept for the emperor's pleasure. But perhaps most impressive was the library, where scribes maintained records on bark paper and deer hide of everything from tribute payments to astronomical observations. Picture these scholar priests bent over their work, using brushes made from animal hair to paint the complex glyphs that recorded laws, histories, and religious knowledge. They maintained maps of the empire's roads and waterways, genealogies of noble families stretching back generations, calendars predicting eclipses and other celestial events with remarkable accuracy. Moctezuma himself embodied the height of Mexica culture and sophistication. He was said to change his clothes 4 times each day, never wearing the same garment twice. His meals were prepared by teams of cooks who served him hundreds of different dishes, from which he would select perhaps a dozen to taste. When he traveled through his city, his feet never touched the ground, as nobles spread rich cloths before his path and swept away any dust that might soil his passage. Yet this luxury served a purpose beyond mere indulgence. The emperor's magnificence was a visual representation of the empire's power and divine favor. When foreign ambassadors visited Tenochtitlan, they were meant to be overwhelmed by what they saw, to return to their homes with reports that would discourage rebellion and encourage submission. Every detail of court protocol was designed to emphasize the vast distance between the emperor and ordinary mortals, reinforcing the belief that he ruled by divine mandate. The religious life of the empire reached new levels of complexity under Moctezuma's reign. New temples were built, new ceremonies instituted, new forms of sacrifice developed. The emperor himself took an active role in religious observances, sometimes serving as a priest in the most important ceremonies. Picture him atop the great temple at dawn, his body painted with sacred designs, offering incense and prayers to the rising sun while thousands of his subjects watched from below. But it was also during this golden age that the first signs of future troubles began to appear. The empire's very success created problems that previous rulers had not had to face. The constant demand for sacrificial victims led to increasingly frequent wars, which drained resources and created resentment among subject peoples. The concentration of wealth in Tenochtitlan created inequality that strained traditional social bonds. And perhaps most ominously, strange omens began to appear with increasing frequency: comets in the sky, temples mysteriously catching fire, statues weeping tears of blood. Moctezuma, despite his power and wisdom, found himself troubled by prophecies that spoke of the return of the god Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, who had once ruled the land before being driven away by Tezcatlipoca. According to ancient tradition, this god would return from the east in a year bearing his name, bringing either renewal or destruction to the world. As Moctezuma stood in his magnificent palace, surrounded by all the wealth and beauty his empire had achieved, he could not have known that strange men with pale skin and 4-legged beasts were already making their way across the waters from that prophetic direction. In the early hours of a February morning in 1519, lookouts posted along the eastern coast of the Mexica Empire observed something that defied all their experience and understanding. 3 floating mountains appeared on the horizon, moving across the waters without the aid of paddle or current. As these strange objects drew closer, the watchers could see that they carried structures like temples, and that beings moved about on their surfaces, beings that caught the sunlight in ways that suggested they might be covered in silver or some other reflective metal. The news of this sighting traveled with the speed of fear along the empire's efficient communication networks. Runners carried the word from village to village, each relay adding new details and interpretations to the growing legend. By the time the report reached Moctezuma in his palace at Tenochtitlan, the story had grown to include descriptions of creatures that were half man and half deer, of fire that could be thrown through the air, of beings whose faces were pale as limestone and whose hair resembled dry grass. Picture Moctezuma as he received this news, seated in his council chamber surrounded by his most trusted advisors. The morning light streamed through windows covered with translucent sheets of mica, casting shifting patterns on walls decorated with the finest artworks his empire could produce. Yet all this magnificence seemed suddenly fragile as he considered the implications of what he was hearing. Could these strangers be the returning gods that ancient prophecies had foretold? The leader of these newcomers was a man named Hernán Cortés, though the Mexica would know him first by other names and titles. He was 34 years old, born in the Spanish province of Extremadura to a family of modest means who had struggled to provide him with the education of a gentleman. Like many men of his generation, he had come to the Americas seeking the fortune and glory that had eluded him in Spain. He possessed the ruthlessness of a born conqueror, tempered by a politician's understanding of when to negotiate and when to strike. More importantly, Cortés possessed something that no amount of personal ambition could have provided: devastating technological advantages that made his small force far more powerful than its numbers suggested. His men carried steel swords and wore steel armor that could turn aside obsidian blades. They had crossbows that could pierce Mexica shields, and firearms that created thunderous noise and deadly projectiles. Most shocking of all, they rode horses, animals unknown in the Americas, that gave them speed and height advantages that transformed the very nature of warfare. When Cortés and his force of perhaps 600 men landed on the coast, they quickly demonstrated both their power and their intentions. At Patancan, they fought their first battle against Mexica forces, defeating a much larger army through the combined effect of their weapons, tactics, and the psychological impact of their horses and firearms. But Cortés understood that military force alone would never be sufficient to conquer an empire of millions. He would need allies, and he found them among the very peoples that Mexica expansion had made into unwilling subjects. The most important of these allies came from the city-state of Tlaxcala, which had maintained its independence through centuries of warfare with the Mexica Empire. The Tlaxcalans were warriors as fierce as any in central Mexico, and their hatred of Mexica domination ran deeper than their suspicion of the strange newcomers. When Cortés proved his military capabilities in battle against them, they chose to join his cause rather than face destruction. Picture the moment when these traditional enemies shook hands in alliance, knowing that their collaboration would reshape the political landscape of an entire continent. As Cortés and his growing force of Spanish and indigenous allies moved inland toward Tenochtitlan, Moctezuma found himself trapped in an impossible situation. His advisors were divided between those who counseled immediate attack and those who urged caution, arguing that these might indeed be gods who could not be opposed by mortal force. Meanwhile, more troubling news arrived daily. The strangers had destroyed the idols in coastal temples, they had demanded gold and silver as tribute, they had made alliances with cities that had previously paid homage to Tenochtitlan. The emperor's response revealed both the sophistication and the fatal limitations of Mexica diplomacy. He sent embassies bearing gifts of incredible value, artworks in gold and silver, feather cloaks of breathtaking beauty, precious stones, and exotic foods. These gifts were intended to demonstrate both his power and his peaceful intentions, to convince the strangers that they would be better served as allies than as enemies. But to Cortés and his men, these offerings were simply proof that even greater wealth awaited them in the capital city. As the Spanish force approached the Valley of Mexico, climbing through mountain passes that had been traveled by traders and pilgrims for centuries, they encountered sights that amazed even men who had seen the cities of Renaissance Europe. The valley spread below them like a jeweled bowl, its lakes dotted with islands and crossed by causeways that seemed to float above the water. Tenochtitlan itself rose from Lake Texcoco like a vision from an illuminated manuscript, its whitewashed buildings and soaring pyramids reflecting the afternoon sun with such brilliance that some of the Spanish thought they were seeing a mirage. On November 8, 1519, the two worlds that had developed in isolation for millennia finally came face to face on the Great Causeway leading into Tenochtitlan. Moctezuma, carried in a litter decorated with gold and precious stones, met Cortés at the entrance to his capital city. Picture that moment, the Mexican emperor in all his magnificent regalia facing a Spanish conquistador in steel armor, each representing civilizations that had never imagined the other's existence. They exchanged greetings and gifts with careful ceremony, neither fully understanding the forces they had set in motion, but both sensing that their meeting would mark the end of one age and the beginning of another. What followed that first meeting between Moctezuma and Cortés would unfold like a tragedy written by the gods themselves, where every attempt to prevent disaster only hastened its arrival. The Spanish were initially received as honored guests, housed in the palace that had once belonged to Moctezuma's father, treated with the ceremony due to important ambassadors. But within days, the fundamental incompatibility between their two worlds became clear. Where the Mexica saw divine visitors to be honored and appeased, the Spanish saw wealthy enemies to be conquered and plundered. Picture the tension that must have filled those early days, as hundreds of Spanish soldiers wandered through the greatest city of the Americas, their eyes widening at treasures beyond European imagination. They saw walls covered in gold, gardens filled with rare birds, markets offering goods they had never dreamed existed. To them, it was all potential loot, waiting to be seized. To their Mexica hosts, these visitors were committing countless breaches of sacred protocol, handling holy objects with casual hands, trampling on spaces where only priests were allowed to walk. The crisis came with shocking suddenness. During a ceremony honoring the god Huitzilopochtli, when hundreds of Mexican nobles had gathered in the great temple complex to dance and worship, Spanish soldiers under Pedro de Alvarado's command surrounded the celebrants and attacked without warning. The massacre that followed was so complete and brutal that even some Spanish chroniclers later expressed shame at the memory. Noble warriors who had survived countless battles died trapped in a sacred space, cut down by steel swords while wearing their finest ceremonial costumes. The people of Tenochtitlan rose in fury that shook the very foundations of the city. Thousands poured into the streets, armed with whatever weapons they could find, determined to drive out the strangers who had violated their most sacred spaces. The Spanish found themselves besieged in their palace quarters, surrounded by enemies who now understood that no accommodation was possible between their worlds. The bridges on the causeways were destroyed, cutting off escape routes. Food and water were denied to the invaders, who began to realize that their technological advantages might not be sufficient to save them from the wrath of an entire city. In desperation, Cortés forced Moctezuma to appear before his people, hoping that the emperor's authority might calm the uprising. Picture the tragic scene, the great ruler who had once been treated as a god, now essentially a prisoner of foreign invaders, standing on the roof of his own palace to plead with his subjects for peace. The response was heartbreaking in its finality. Stones and arrows flew from the crowd below, and one struck Moctezuma in the head, wounding him mortally. Whether he died from this wound or was killed by the Spanish remains unclear, but his death marked the end of an empire that had ruled central Mexico for nearly a century. Realizing that their position was hopeless, the Spanish attempted to escape from the city under cover of darkness on the night of June 30, 1520, a night they would remember as La Noche Triste, the sad night. Picture the desperate retreat as hundreds of men burdened with looted gold tried to cross the causeways while Mexica warriors attacked from canoes on both sides. Many Spanish soldiers, weighted down by treasure they refused to abandon, drowned in the lake when the bridges collapsed beneath them. Others were captured alive and carried away to be sacrificed to the gods they had insulted. Cortés himself barely escaped, and by morning more than half his force was dead or captured. But the story did not end with this Mexica victory. Cortés regrouped among his Tlaxcalan allies, and within a year he had returned with a larger force of Spanish reinforcements and thousands of indigenous warriors eager to join what they now saw as a successful rebellion against Mexica domination. More devastating than any army, however, was an invisible enemy that the Spanish had brought with them, epidemic diseases to which the peoples of the Americas had no resistance. Smallpox struck Tenochtitlan like divine punishment, killing not just commoners but nobles, priests, and warriors, all the people whose knowledge and leadership the empire needed to function. Picture the city during those terrible months, once crowded neighborhoods falling silent as entire families succumbed to disease, temples standing empty because there were no priests left to perform the ceremonies, markets closing because there were no merchants left to trade. The new emperor, Cuitlahuac, died of smallpox within months of taking power. His successor, Cuauhtémoc, inherited an empire already half destroyed by invisible enemies. The final siege of Tenochtitlan lasted 80 days, from May to August 1521. Cortés had learned from his earlier defeat, building a fleet of small warships that could control the lake and prevent supplies from reaching the city. Systematically, the Spanish and their allies destroyed the causeways and filled in the canals, turning the island city into a trap for its own defenders. Building by building, plaza by plaza, they fought their way toward the great temple at the city's heart. The Mexica defenders fought with the desperate courage of those who knew they were defending not just their city, but their entire way of life. Every house became a fortress, every canal a battleground. When the Spanish breached one neighborhood, the defenders would retreat to the next, leaving behind traps and obstacles that slowed the advance. Women and children joined the fighting, throwing stones from rooftops, defending their homes with kitchen knives when they had no other weapons. The end came on August 13, 1521, when Cuauhtémoc was captured while attempting to escape across the lake. Picture the last emperor of the Mexica as he was brought before Cortés, young, wounded, but still defiant, representing the final flicker of a civilization that had illuminated central Mexico for centuries. The great temple was pulled down stone by stone. The books and codices that contained the accumulated wisdom of generations were burned. The gold and silver that had decorated temples and palaces was melted down and shipped to Spain. But perhaps the greatest tragedy was not the destruction of buildings or even the loss of lives, but the obliteration of knowledge and memory. Within a generation, the complex agricultural systems that had fed millions fell into disuse. The trade networks that had connected distant regions were abandoned. The astronomical observations, the mathematical calculations, the philosophical insights that Mexica scholars had developed over centuries were lost as the people who held this knowledge died or were forbidden to teach it. Where Tenochtitlan had stood, the Spanish built a new city they called Mexico City, using stones from the destroyed Mexica temples as foundation material for their churches and government buildings. The lake that had cradled the island city was gradually drained and filled, until eventually no trace remained of the waterways that had once made Tenochtitlan one of the world's most beautiful cities. The floating gardens were abandoned, the aviaries emptied, the libraries burned. An entire world had passed away, leaving behind only fragments and echoes to suggest what had been lost. As our journey through the rise and fall of the Aztec Empire draws to its close, let yourself return slowly to the present moment. Feel your breathing, steady and natural, carrying you back from those distant shores of Lake Texcoco to the comfort of your own space and time. The story we have shared tonight is one of extraordinary human achievement and profound loss, of a civilization that reached heights of beauty and complexity, only to vanish like morning mist when the conditions that sustained it changed forever. In your mind's eye, you might still see the shimmer of feathers in the marketplace, hear the splash of paddles against the calm lake waters, smell the incense rising from countless temples toward the sky. But perhaps what remains most powerfully is the reminder that all human civilizations, no matter how mighty they appear, are temporary flowers blooming briefly in the vast garden of time. The Mexica built their empire believing it would last forever, as all peoples do. They created works of art and architecture that they thought would speak to future generations, never imagining that so much would be lost so completely. Yet something does endure. In the faces of their descendants, in the foods that still grow in Mexican soil, in the few codices that survived the burning, in the very stones that Spanish builders used to construct their colonial city, the Mexica presence continues. Memory transforms, but it does not die completely. Feel your body now, heavy and relaxed against your bed. Let your shoulders soften a little more with each breath. Your journey through the past has ended, but your rest is just beginning. The stories we carry with us into sleep become part of our dreams, part of the endless conversation between what was and what is. Release any tension you might be holding from the day. Let your breathing slow and deepen naturally. Like the gentle lapping of lake water against the chinampas in that long-ago dawn, let the rhythm of your breath carry you toward peaceful sleep. The pyramids have fallen, but the mountains still watch over the valley. The emperors have passed away, but the stars still wheel overhead in their ancient patterns. And you, carrying these stories with you into the night, become part of the continuing human conversation about what it means to build something beautiful, even when we know it cannot last forever. Sleep well, and dream of floating gardens and feathered serpents, of eagles and obsidian mirrors, of a people who believed so strongly in their destiny that they transformed a swampy island into one of the wonders of the world. If you're still awake, subscribe, leave a like, and tell us in the comments which empire should we explore next? Sweet dreams.